Ah.
So hello to everyone joining us on the line. We will get going with this webinar shortly. We'll just give people a few minutes to dial in and join us. In the meantime, if you could use the chat function on your control panel and just type in and let us know where you're joining us from, that would be brilliant. We tend to get a lot of people from the Australian capital cities, which is brilliant, but it's also good to know if we have anyone joining us from the regions, or indeed internationally as well. We do tend to get a few international attendees. Brisbane, wonderful, hello. Singapore, lovely. Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brunei, hello. Townsville. You've got a bit of a mix here, Duncan. You've got the capital cities, the regions, and the international attendees as well.
Oh, good.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for that. It's really interesting to know where you're joining us from today. My name is Holly Baldwin. I'm from Informa Corporate Learning. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Duncan Seddon, who's going to deliver this webinar on the hydrogen economy, looking at fundamentals, technology and economics. The content of this webinar will probably go for about 20 to 25 minutes. After that, we will do a short Q&A session where we'll answer as many questions as we possibly can. So please, 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 as the webinar goes along, if you have any questions, please pop them into either the chat function or the Q&A tab, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can at the end. But in the meantime, welcome, Duncan.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, and to our course on the hydrogen economy, fundamentals, technology and economics. It's in this is an enormous area and it's growing extremely rapidly. So we essentially today will just cover the main areas which are of interest to most people. There are, of course, lots numbers of little niche areas in this technology, which particularly individual groups and people may be interested in, and we'll just canvass some of those as we go along. As far as the economics are concerned, we'll be discussing in broad terms the economics, but we, as Holly will tell you later, we run a course which details in more detail the nitty-gritty of the economics of all the various types of options that are available in the field. So what is the hydrogen economy? Essentially, the idea is to replace all the fossil fuels essentially with hydrogen, and essentially to displace it from vehicles or from other uses such as power station generation and the like. So where do you get hydrogen from? Well, on Earth, there are only two sources of hydrogen. There's water, seawater and the like, from the sea, rain and whatever, and natural gas, methane. Both these molecules contain hydrogen and they're very high energy, holding them together. So you need a lot of energy to break them apart. In essence, for methane, natural gas, as it were, and also this goes for coal and biomass, essentially what we do is we burn this material that we can see here, usually in oxygen of some sort, and you pull out the hydrogen and you make carbon dioxide. This route is commonly referred to as blue hydrogen. At the end of the day, in order to get rid of the to eventually get the hydrogen economy working, we're mainly interested in removing that CO2. So that CO2 has to be captured, carbon geosequestrated and stored somewhere. And there are many projects essentially now around the world looking at this, where essentially we make the hydrogen and we make CO2 and we geosequestrate the CO2. There are a few minor operations where essentially people are doing research and development and essentially on direct cracking to make hydrogen and carbon. And we should kind of mention that, but none of them have really attracted much, to my mind, serious interest yet. The other way we make hydrogen is so-called green hydrogen, where we use electricity to electrolyze water into hydrogen and oxygen. This route does not produce any carbon dioxide, so there's no geosequestration about it. It's totally green in the sense that the power that we use to generate for this electrolysis route comes from wind, solar, or some other source which does not have some CO2 emissions. There are, again, quite a few variations on the theme here. There's a whole plethora of different colors of hydrogen. There's gray hydrogen, where essentially you use nuclear power, essentially to generate the water. Okay. So our blue hydrogen, which is essentially, there are quite a few large projects around the world on doing this at the moment. The blue hydrogen requires carbon dioxide disposal. So we go for the CO2 capture, and there are several technologies here for this. There's membranes, we can separate the CO2 from it. There's pressure swing absorption, which is a common one used. But the most common one that's used industrially currently and still being under development and improvement is solvent absorption, which can take several forms. The carbon capture, once you've captured the carbon in these methods and technologies here, will produce the carbon dioxide in a relatively pure form. And it can be compressed into essentially a liquid, or really a super condensed fluid. And this can go to disposal. The CO2 disposal options, there's several options here. There's saline aquifers, deep coal beds, enhanced oil recovery, or deep sea disposal. The main ones currently used in the world today are enhanced oil recovery. This is widely practiced in the North American oil fields and the like, especially the ones in the south, where essentially CO2 is injected quite deeply into the oil wells, and this essentially, the CO2 displaces the oil from the geological strata and absorbs itself into this strata and doesn't come out. That's the idea anyway. There are specific projects, very large projects, in Norway and in Australia, essentially dumping CO2 into saline aquifers, which are again in very deep, low-lying strata, a kilometre or more deep. And these saline aquifers can be extremely large and can hold vast amounts of CO2. So this is the idea, essentially the impetus behind carbon geosequestration is essentially to dump large volumes of CO2 into something which will hold it. Coal beds, it's theory, but I don't think there's any being practiced currently at the moment. And there's also the feasibility of depositing the CO2 in very deep ocean trenches and the like, where again it will, under the water pressure, it will remain as a super condensed fluid. Okay. Well, how we've made our hydrogen and we've got rid of the CO2, or we've made it by electrolysis. How are we going to store it and transport it? So if we've made the hydrogen from either fossil fuels with geosequestration or from renewables, well, we can move it as compressed gas. And this is what you see around currently in most of the world, where essentially it's being carted around on the back of trailer trucks and the like. You can store it in salt caverns. You can convert it into a liquid, and you can convert it into an intermediate fluid. And there are two which are particularly of interest in the world currently. One is ammonia. Ammonia NH3 contains about 17% hydrogen. So you can convert the hydrogen into ammonia and move the ammonia around and then crack it at the other end, as it were. Or you can do it by methyl cyclohexane. This is known as the Spira process. Methyl cyclohexane contains about 6% hydrogen. And when it's cracked at the other end, it makes toluene, which is then moved back, which is then hydrogenated into methyl cyclohexane. And any of these methods can be used to move it by truck, by ship, or by pipeline. There are the main issues with this is salt caverns are the cheapest way in which you can store hydrogen. Storing it as a liquid is feasible, but it's quite expensive to make. The liquefaction of hydrogen is not a cheap option, and it tends to be a drag on that kind of route is the actual cost of actually making the liquid. It's quite a more involved subject than making liquefied natural gas, for instance, LNG. Ammonia is a well-known world commodity. It's moved around in ships all over the place. And methylcyclohexane, this stuff, is essentially very similar to gasoline. So you're moving petrol around by pipeline, truck, or whatever you want. So that kind of method. Okay. Competitive price. How does the hydrogen, when it gets to the other end, would it compete against the conventional fossil fuels that we have today? Stationary applications are an issue where it will essentially try to displace coal or liquefied natural gas. Now, these commodities here are quite cheap. So it's very difficult, essentially, to envisage hydrogen, which if I can make it a piece of orders just to flick back a bit. If we're making this hydrogen here by these routes, clearly it's going to cost a lot more than just using stuff that just comes out of the ground. So whatever we're at the moment, we've got a high price feedstock. So our hydrogen source here is going to be somewhat pricier than coal and LNG. And there will be some kind of issues as to how that displacement might occur. One of the big issues and big areas of interest is the use of hydrogen to essentially displace gasoline and diesel out of fuel cells, out of vehicles. And this is done by means of a hydrogen fuel cell. Now, the hydrogen fuel cell has some advantages over a conventional internal combustion engine. It's quite a bit more efficient in terms of the energy efficiency. It's more than double the efficiency typically. Gasoline and diesel, as you may know, are not very efficient at driving vehicles, whereas fuel cell vehicles are. And this is what helps it to actually gain the range. Unlike electric vehicles, which suffer from short range problems, hydrogen vehicles, in theory, can go to quite longer ranges. It's because of the higher fuel efficiency in the system. The problem that you have with hydrogen is in a fuel cell vehicle is that you've got to carry enough in the vehicle to deliver the range. And the preferred method, there have been other methods been thought of and looked at in the past, such as hydrides and the like, but these have fallen away now to the more commonly accepted way is to compress it to really quite high pressures, 350 or 700 atmospheres, and have a pressurized tank in the back of the vehicle. The tank size would be about 200 liters, about the size of an oil drum. And so that would fit in the back of the vehicle somewhere along the line. And it can be, and these have been shown and have been proved to operate quite well. They are usually made out of composite materials with spiral wire winding around them to make them very strong. And as I say, these can go up to 700 atmospheres. Now, you've got to compress the hydrogen up into that pressure. That is an issue, and it comes at some cost. But that will deliver essentially a gaseous fuel, compressed fuel, to run the operation. It would work somewhat similar to an LPG type vehicle. The filling rates will be very similar, 4 or 5 minutes. We're not looking at like electric vehicles where you've got many hours to recharge them. So that's the general selling point. So the competitive position of hydrogen against gasoline and diesel is in fact this improved efficiency, plus and we've got to accept this now, that these materials essentially are highly taxed in many jurisdictions. And whether or not hydrogen will be taxed would be a moot point, you know, and it would probably change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But certainly the tax relief and whatever on hydrogen fuel vehicles would obviously will clearly help it in its competitive position. Okay, let's see what else we've got. One of the things that we do and do in the course is to consider certain case studies, essentially to look at how the hydrogen economy would work in practice. And there is a couple of ideas here where you maybe have remote solar power generation. You make the hydrogen by electrolysis on a large scale. You move it into an urban centre, and we've taken urban Australia as the example. And we essentially use that as a fuel here. So this requires essentially figuring out or working out and analysing what the costs would be in a remote location using an electrolysis and solar power type system, or backed up with wind or whatever, solar wind operation. A pipeline is an obvious method here. A pipeline which may be essentially, there's a lot of interest in using natural gas pipelines for this to actually blend the hydrogen into the line and then take it out at the other end, or a dedicated pipeline, or some other method of doing it. For example, we might say, oh, well, why make the hydrogen out in a remote area? Why don't we just move the power to an urban centre and transmit the electricity, and then use the electricity at the urban centre to make hydrogen in a local manner? And you know, this is an area which is, in this particular case study, we kind of work our way through that. A couple of other things of interest was to make hydrogen on the Northwest Shelf, NWS hydrogen, by either blue hydrogen, because there's a lot of natural gas out there. There's a lot of geosequestration sites. The world's largest geosequestration site is on the Northwest Shelf at Barrow Island. So that's feasible. Or we can make it by essentially wind and solar combined, and we make the hydrogen, and then we'll move it to over a transoceanic voyage and the like to Japan. This kind of project here is kind of being well looked at. So here we've got to get the hydrogen to Japan. Do we liquefy it? Do we turn it to ammonia? Do we use the Spira process and essentially ship it either as liquid ammonia or as methyl cyclohexane? Then what's the cost at the other end of recovering the hydrogen? Liquid hydrogen, we need to regasify it. Ammonia, we need to crack it. And methyl cyclohexane route, we have to turn it back into toluene and move the toluene back again on a essentially backloaded operation. Another idea that's current, certainly in this country, is to turn some of the large coal deposits into hydrogen and move the hydrogen to Japan. And this is being pursued, as you may know, by the Kawasaki company and others, where they're looking at Victorian lignite, which is a vast reserve of carbon. And of course, the Victorian lignite would be burned, would make hydrogen. We'd either liquefy it or use one of these other routes to take it to Japan. But the CO2 that we make from that, which is quite a lot, would be essentially gathered, and it would be moved over and used to inject into the depleted gas and oil reserve that are currently in the Bass Strait. Now, these are big enough to hold all this CO2, but it's obviously going to have to be done at some cost, and there's kind of an issues as to how one handles that. Well, a few more things here. There's some emerging issues that have come across as they go along. I've been doing this course now for about a year, and we've found that everything changes, and the more kind of our ideas come along. One of the ones that is current, it's getting more press, is power to liquids, PTL. What the idea is you make solar powered or blue hydrogen, green or blue hydrogen, but let's say it's green hydrogen. You take carbon dioxide from one of your other sources, which you've a geosequestrated source. You treat it in some way or other, and you convert this into methanol or liquid fuels. You're thereby using hydrogen and carbon dioxide, which in theory, well, it's practical or not, I'm not so sure. You could be extracting the CO2 from the atmosphere, but let's say, but necessary. And you make methanol, which is currently made directly from fossil fuels, or you make liquid fuels out of it. And this is getting some particular interest. One of the big drivers for all this, for going into liquid fuels currently, is to find a way to provide enough fuel for the for jet fuel. There doesn't seem to be an easy alternative to jet fuel, to jet engines. And so the idea is to make jet fuel out of some kind of renewable source. Now, there's a limited amount of land area for growing coconut palm and things like that, which you can turn into jet fuel. There's a limited amount of urban waste rubbish which you can use to turn into jet fuel. So this would be a method of making jet fuel on quite a substantial scale to solve the problem of where the airlines are going to get their non-CO2 fuel from. So there's quite a bit of interest in that. And this process essentially is the Fischer-Tropsch process, which is well known. The other issue that's emerging is essentially to do with the carbon credits that might be generated. There is a view that carbon will be taxed in some way, so that if and so how this would actually work out. If we have our hydrogen, blue or green hydrogen here, and it's used to displace a fossil fuel, the fossil fuel, of course, emits carbon dioxide. There is we use the fossil fuel, we generate essentially a carbon tax. Well, if we displace it with hydrogen, is there a carbon abatement credit, some kind of carbon credit for that, which can be net backed into the price of the hydrogen in some way, so that essentially, I noted earlier, the production costs of these relative to fossil fuels is relatively high, but this may be used now to essentially effectively reduce the cost of the hydrogen that you make and use in a fuel type operation. I'm going to leave it there and take questions, and so it's over to you, Holly.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Duncan. It's such a emerging topic, both in terms of the processing, the distribution. So thank you so much for that information. We've had some brilliant questions coming in. So we'll get to our Q&A very shortly. So please do stay on the line and ask us any more questions you have. Duncan does run a program with us around hydrogen industry fundamentals. There's more information obviously on the screen. Don't worry too much about taking all the information down now. We will send over an email to everyone on the line today with the slides and recording from this session. We're also delighted to offer everyone a 10% discount who's joined us today. We run these programs fairly regularly, as you can see, in September and October. And if you have a team that you think would benefit and you want to maybe customize aspects of our training, then please do get in touch, as we can do that as well. So yes, with a few questions coming in about people in terms of the recording. So yes, we will send the recording over post-webinar. So now to the questions. As I said, we've had some brilliant ones coming in, Duncan. So the first one says, can we have a percentage breakup on hydrogen availability from seawater, methane, biomass, etc.?
Yeah, let's have a look. Let me go back to the beginning here. The main we're looking now at an emerging technology. There is very little hydrogen being produced for this emerging technology relative to the amount of hydrogen that's made and used in industry. Hydrogen is widely used in industry, in the petrochemicals business and in the refining operations. World refinings are big users of hydrogen and hydrogen plants. So the majority of that hydrogen currently is made from natural gas into, they don't bother geosequestrating the CO2 at the moment, but it's a natural gas-based operation. There is some hydrogen made in some parts of the world by electrolysis, but not much, relatively speaking. These are really confined to areas where you have particularly cheap power, such as Norway and the like, which has run hydrogen plants for many, many decades using its hydropower operations. This is negligible. There are some chemical processes which actually operate to do this. There are processes which make carbon black. So you start with something like a petroleum fuel here, and you gasify it and you make a lot of carbon, and that's what you're targeting to make carbon black for tire black and the like. So to go back to the questions, not a lot this way currently, and essentially, and coal. Chinese use a lot of coal, and they make a lot of hydrogen from natural gas or synthesis gas using coal. There are a few ideas around to make it from biomass, wood chip, things like that, but these will be small scale compared to the natural gas routes. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Duncan. The next one says EOR. What is the E, please? I think this was in relation to when you were talking about CO2 disposal.
This is, I should have spelled it out. This is enhanced oil recovery. In many parts of the world, when you whack the pipe down, the drill down to recover oil, you only recover about 10% of the oil that's in place. And in such oil fields, for a variety of reasons, porosity, viscosity of the oil and the like, you have enhanced oil recovery schemes. Now, these take several different forms, but a large portion of them use CO2 injection, where you inject CO2 at pressure, high pressure, into the subterranean strata. This dissolves in the oil. It makes it more fluid, lowers its viscosity, so it flows better out of the line. And the CO2 takes up the positions, it displaces the oil from the strata essentially and remains in the strata. So that's EOR. Widely used in the US and Canada.
Wonderful. Thank you, Duncan. The next one says, if hydrogen was stored in a vehicle fuel cell, what would be the shelf life of the vehicle fuel cell? And if it did need to be replaced, how would it be disposed of?
Okay, just going on to about maybe vehicles, just remind myself about this. These fuel cells here are quite complex pieces of gear when it comes down to it. The current ones have a lot of platinum in it. So there's obviously an incentive to recover it and recycle it, even it's just for the precious metal alone. So I don't think there will be an issue with essentially waiting for technology to come along. I mean, so this stuff's, it's very valuable material. The composite steel cylinder disposal of that, well, of course, you've got a nice spirally wound steel cylinder. It's going to be, but it's not going to be straightforward. It's going to be like tires. You've got essentially multiple things together, multiple metals together tied up with composites and the like. Again, that's we would hope to see an emerging technology for that, but not at the moment, not an obvious one anyway. Okay. Oh, the things will last. The things will last. Again, the manufacturers are claiming 10 years for these. Yeah.
Wonderful. The next question, Duncan says, how technical is this course? Is it good for non-technical people?
Yes. In the sense that we've had on the course a lot of what you might call people from with an economics background are more interested in the cost structures of these things. So that's your bent rather than the technology. But I do try to keep the chemistry simple as I can.
Wonderful. The next question we have said, why are we even discussing anything but green hydrogen? If we want a global H2 economy, surely CO2 capture is uneconomic. That's a great question.
Well, it depends where you are and what you're doing with it. It's certainly not very economic from coal-fired power stations. It costs a lot of money. But if you're making it from natural gas, you end up with CO2 in a nice concentrated stream, and it's really very low cost. And all you have to do to prove this is to look at the EOR, enhanced oil recovery operations in the US, which are quite extensive, and they pay for CO2. It has a price to it, and it's $30-ish a ton, right? So that's what the disposal cost is, roughly.
Thank you. The next question, Duncan, says, I might be jumping in early here, but are we just trading problems by having to deal with excess CO2?
Trading problems. Yes, in a way, if you're making it from natural gas and coal, you then have a problem of disposing the CO2. That is true. Which is, it does come at a cost. It's got to be added into the system. It probably doubles the actual manufacturing costs from blue hydrogen, of hydrogen made from fossil fuels, in broad terms. It's still, unfortunately, cheaper. That's still a lot cheaper than the electrolysis route.
Yeah, it's still something that definitely needs to be considered for sure. So that's
all these things need development. I mean, so one of the serious drawbacks to the green hydrogen route is the electrolysis cell itself, which surprisingly are not that efficient.
Yeah, that was a good question. The next one says, hi, Dr. Seddon, very interesting presentation. If we are talking about minimizing overall life cycle CO2 emissions, when we make green H2 or green ammonia, not blue, would the best route not be to displace industrial users currently made with coal or natural gas, e.g. fertilizers?
Yes. That would be the obvious route. Can I just talk about hydrogen at the moment, rather than the ammonia bottle? That's right. What you're saying is right, and a lot of the fertilizer guys are interested in this. At the moment, it's not that economic, but if you look at where a lot of these hydrogen projects are to make hydrogen, they are in Europe and the US, in areas where there are long pipelines piping hydrogen around to various users, refineries and the like. So in essence, that is what it's doing. Essentially, you have a stage development. The idea would be you have a stage development. You initially displace fossil fuel hydrogen out of the system, and then maybe you go on to build specific hydrogen manufacturing operations for moving it around as its own energy fuel. But currently, there are a lot of, people don't want to go into making 100,000 tons of hydrogen at a time, but they want to do experiments or developments of semi-commercial scales of making 50 or 50,000 tons, say. And where you're going to do this? Well, the easiest way to, rather than find a market for your 50,000 tons, is actually to go to where the market is, and that's usually near one of these long pipelines, quite length pipelines, 1,000 kilometers long in the US, hundreds of kilometers in Europe, and you become essentially a seller into that pipeline, and there are many users, just like natural gas operations. Now, going back to the fertilizer part, the problem that you have with fertilizers is that, yes, in the Western world, we kind of, would be interested in all this, but in many parts of the world, and I'm just speculating here because I don't know how it kind of would work out. In many parts of the world, ammonia and fertilizer production and explosives production is essentially considered by the central governments as a strategic industries, and they interfere with it and want to control it. So most of the world has very highly regulated fertilizer production. The amount of free trade in fertilizer is small compared to what you might call a captive type operations. But the way you go, I don't know. I mean, so the problem of displacing ammonia from the international trade, using green ammonia, which will cost more, is the fact that the big player on the block, the two biggest players on the block, are Russia and China. Now, are they going to come to the party? We wait with bated breath to see what happens in Glasgow. Okay.
Thank you. The next question says, why is hydrogen created via nuclear energy called grey hydrogen?
Nuclear power. Oh, that's what the Canadians call it. They have a lot of nuclear plants, and they say, oh, well, we've got all this non-CO2 generating power. We'll call our hydrogen grey, as opposed to green, which implies solar or renewables. There's somebody having purple somewhere. I don't know, forgot. I think that's biomass.
Going through all the rainbow.
Oh yes, full rainbow.
The next one says, is the net process of producing hydrogen worse in terms of cost and environmental than for converting fossil fuels?
It costs more. It's fundamentally costs more. You can, at the end of the day, compete with stuff which oozes out the ground. Yeah. Well, hydrogen is sophisticated. You've got to spend a lot of energy breaking the bond, either the carbon-hydrogen bond in methane or the water bond, the hydrogen-oxygen bond in water, and it's a lot of energy.
Yeah. The next one says, you describe a difficulty for H2 to displace coal and LNG because they're cheap. However, in most cases, the cost of dealing with CO2 from LNG and coal is not factored in. Are they truly cheaper?
Well, that's the good question, and it comes back to this, doesn't it? Is if you're going to have an abatement process which you're going to tax the carbon emissions, you essentially generate a better opportunity for hydrogen to substitute. Yeah, I mean, but no, at the moment, there's the European scheme, but there's not, it's all kind of, well, frankly, quite Mickey Mouse schemes for pricing carbon. I know there's a lot of people would like to see it. The banks would, they'll make a real killing on it. Buying and selling carbon credits.
Definitely. There was some good couple of questions there on costs. The next one, Duncan says, I have seen studies in repurposing end-of-life natural gas networks for hydrogen. Do you see this as feasible?
End of life?
Yeah, end-of-life natural gas networks.
You mean to say using the gas network for hydrogen transport?
Yeah, so repurposing.
The answer is yes, in the sense that people have converted all the oil pipelines to move hydrogen. There are some limits to it. There's technical issues with regard to the steel fittings and the like, and hydrogen, and that limits the pressure, the line pressure. That's even true with a hydrogen only dedicated lines. They are more costly to maintain and use. You have to have regular flare stacks for hydrogen lines. There are safety issues. If the hydrogen line leaks, it will almost certainly spontaneously ignite, which is a problem.
Yeah. The next one I like, Duncan, because it wants to get your kind of personal insight and knowledge. Looking at the current industry situation, in your opinion, in how many years would it become economical and feasible to widely use hydrogen as a fuel?
It's going to be at least a decade. The current projects at the moment are small. There are a few big ones, but they're mainly quite small. And so there are a lot of people sticking the toe in the water trying to figure out what it's all about before making the plunge. But at the end of the day, apart from refinery operations, petrochemical operations, and the like, there's no real market for hydrogen. It's not like LNG. You can't kind of set up a system with Platts and saying, well, okay, I've got 5,000 tons of hydrogen to sell. Would you come and buy it to run your fuel cell vehicles? It's not that whole market area has got to be developed. There's memoranda of understanding flying around, that if we could produce hydrogen below such and such a price, some countries like Japan have said, well, they would be interested in buying it, but there are no actual firm contracts to do this yet. It's going to be at least a decade. People like to think you can do things quick, but usually that's just a wrong idea, really. Things take time.
Yeah, that's probably a good, I guess, time frame, though. In terms of
we're in the very early stages yet of the hydrogen economy.
Yeah. The next one, Duncan says, what do you think the risks are in using H2? I heard that storage and transport for H2 are much more difficult than natural gas.
The problem with hydrogen is if it's at pressure, when it leaks, it spontaneously ignites. The flame temperature is very high, and because it doesn't contain carbon, you can't see the flame. So you've got a flame that's at 2,000 odd degrees centigrade, which will slice through metal, and you can't see it. Yeah, except the heat rising from the flame. The Schlieren effects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next one, Duncan.
That's, and everybody's seen pictures of the Hindenburg.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The next one, Duncan says, how easy is it to separate hydrogen and natural gas?
Interesting. Depends how much money you've got. If you want 100% hydrogen out of the natural gas, you get it, you will liquefy the natural gas, you do it cryogenically. All the other methods, PSA, membrane of it, leave some hydrogen in the natural gas, possibly as much as 2 or 3%. So if your pipeline says 10% hydrogen, you may end up losing 3% of that 10% still in the gas with a PSA type system. That's my today's view. It's a kind of developing area. People are putting, because this idea of using natural gas pipelines has now been around a long time. People are asking that kind of question, and you find out getting 10%, getting it all out is not going to be that necessarily that easy. maybe you're happy to leave a bit in.
Mm. The next one's quite an interesting one as well, Duncan. It says green hydrogen is being used as a Trojan horse for a new justification of problematic energy projects, such as large hydropower on free-flowing rivers. They've lost favour from investors because of their wider environmental and social impacts. Have any hydrogen leaders identified what really defines environmentally friendly H2? Is there a leading standard, and is there a most progressive government supporter?
Short answer, no. People kind of, for want of a better phrase, corporations tend to blunder into these kind of areas without kind of thinking it through. And before you know where they are, they're throwing loads of money at something which has a fundamental flaw in it. That's kind of my work in the field. But you're right in what you allude to there. One of the big projects in Australia is to actually make hydrogen using hydropower, Tasmanian hydropower and wind power connected together. Essentially, wind power backed up by hydro. But you can imagine them going along after a few years saying, "Oh, this is a great thing. Let's dam the Franklin," and off we go again.
Yeah, we've probably got time for one more question, Duncan. It says, is hydrogen produced from water through metal hydrolysis cheaper than using solar panels?
Metal hydrolysis, no, because you got to make the metal. There's a lot of enthusiasm at the moment for using magnesium and the like. But you got to make the magnesium, and the magnesium takes a hell of a lot of energy. Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that, Duncan. And thank you so much to everyone who's joined us on the line today. Had some brilliant questions coming in. So thank you so much for everyone who's got involved with the session today. But obviously the biggest session of all goes to yourself, Duncan, for those insights and answering as many questions as we possibly could. Okay. We will be sending out, as we said, a follow-up email with a recording of today's session and some more information on the programs that Duncan runs. And obviously a bit more information about what you can learn from them. If you have any more questions, please do email us at training@informa.com.au and we will get back to you as quickly as we can. But Duncan, thank you so much for your time today. It was brilliant to co-host this session with you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for your attention and the questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us from.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.